War between the US and China is more likely than ever, considered nearly a certainty by a growing number of defense analysts, and this is a conflict that neither side can afford to lose. So China has gone all in on defeating the United States of America and toppling it as a global superpower. The bad news? It's likely to succeed. A war with China would lead to the greatest armed conflict the world has seen since World War II, and both sides in the conflict will not give up easily. For China's part, the Chinese Communist Party's entire credibility is built on eventually reuniting Taiwan with the mainland and defeating the US in the Pacific. And it's preparing to do so by military force, as the democratic island nation refuses to consider peaceful reunification with the authoritarian mainland. Taiwan is critically important to the rest of the world for two reasons. For one, the invasion and subjugation of a free democratic nation by an authoritarian power would be the greatest political catastrophe since the Second World War, setting a precedent that could erode the democratically led world order. But the second reason is far more pragmatic. Taiwan may be tiny, but it's a global supplier for semiconductors and advanced electronics, without which modern economies could not operate. China seizing Taiwan would see it in control of nearly the entire world supply of this critical commodity, giving it incredible leverage as it enforces its will on the world stage. Nations as far away from the Pacific as Britain and France would be forced to toe the Chinese Communist Party's line or else face an export ban and a crumbling economy as a result. With Beijing being directly hostile to global values such as human rights, this would mean an overhaul on most values currently held around the world. The US officially maintains strategic ambiguity about any involvement in a Taiwan invasion, but President Joe Biden has said the quiet part out loud 4 times now, as he's promised to directly support Taiwan militarily in case of a war. This has been widely understood to be official U.S. policy across generations of presidents, as the U.S. can ill afford to allow China to seize Taiwan's all-important semiconductor facilities or topple its democratic government. The fall of Taiwan would see the U.S. lose its current status as a guarantor of global security, with cascading and deeply troubling effects for all involved. The system of American-led alliances that has so far unified much of the world and prevented major industrial conflicts of the past would fall apart, and we could see a return to the era of great power competition akin to the early 20th and entire 19th and 18th centuries, only waged with far more destructive weapons. The US cannot lose a war against China, but China too cannot afford to lose if the CCP wishes to remain in power. This makes conflict not only extremely likely, but inherently escalatory, with many fearing it could only end with at least a limited nuclear exchange. To defeat the United States, China is focusing on waging a brutal but lightning war against Taiwan. China doesn't need to completely militarily defeat the US, it just needs to take Taiwan and prevent the US and its allies from retaking the island. This would in effect hurl the US out of the South Pacific for good and strike directly at the heart of the US-led world order. To achieve this, China has focused for 2 decades now on a doctrine of anti-access area denial, or A2D2. Despite the size of China's military and having the world's largest navy, China still lags behind the US military significantly. For example, the Chinese Navy, while slowly closing the gap, still only fields just over 50% the number of battle force missiles of the US Navy. Similarly, its air force is outmatched by the US's almost entirely modern fleet. Chinese and American ground forces comparisons are largely meaningless here, as a US-China war would be decided almost entirely by air and naval action. But China doesn't need to match the US toe-to-toe, because it can exploit America's greatest vulnerability and its own greatest strength: geography. The United States has global commitments for its military and is seen as the guarantor of peace across much of the world. But that guarantee of peace exists only as long as U.S. forces remain credibly able to directly engage bad actors quickly and lethally, and this means having forces deployed all over the globe at all times. This causes a big problem in case of a major conflict. China, meanwhile, is free of such commitment. It need only maintain a token security force along its borders with Russia and India, and it's free to dedicate nearly its entire air force and navy to the task of defeating the U.S. in the Pacific. The U.S. Pacific Fleet is significant, with about 200 ships, but only about 50% of which are actual combat vessels, and 1,500 aircraft, but this pales in comparison with the 340 warships and 2,300 combat aircraft China fields. With China having largely closed the technological gap between the US and itself, Chinese forces may still lag behind the US in terms of technology and capability, but not significantly enough for the vastly outnumbered US Pacific forces to guarantee victory. Leading the charge for China, though, is the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force. Having long ago realized the key to defeating the US was simply to keep it out of the fight, China developed the PLARF into the world's most formidable missile force, with over 2,200 conventional ballistic and cruise missiles. Having observed US operations in both Iraq wars, China's strategy is to disrupt and prevent the months-long buildup of forces that allowed the US to achieve overwhelming critical success against the Iraqi army in both conflicts. This means holding US bases in Japan, the Philippines, Guam, and even Hawaii at threat, and China has hundreds of missiles dedicated to this task alone, more than enough to fully saturate local defenses. In order to take on the US Navy, China also utilizes ballistic missiles in the anti-ship role, and as of 2022, had enough anti-ship missiles to fully saturate the air defenses of each vessel in the US Pacific Fleet. The United States isn't just at a disadvantage in the ballistic missile arena, it hasn't even entered the arena at all. Due to treaties with the Soviet Union and then Russia, the US was banned from developing the type of mid-range ballistic missiles that China fields in the hundreds. This means that the US cannot match Chinese long-range missile striking power, and it would take decades to reach parity, as the US Army is expected to field the first medium-range missile battery in September 2023. Meanwhile, the US is instead forced to rely on air power to strike back, and this is where China once more holds all the advantages. First, the destruction of the airfields across the Pacific would make it extremely difficult for American combat aircraft to be based in theater. While runway repairs can be carried out relatively quickly, fuel storage facilities and aircraft hangars themselves are very vulnerable to ballistic missile attacks. In recent war games, Chinese forces launching an all-out missile attack in a bolt-out-of-the-blue operation succeeded in destroying nearly all forward-deployed U.S. aircraft, knocking U.S. air power out of the war for weeks. Second, the vast distances of the Pacific means that even if the U.S. Air Force and Navy remain operational in the sky, their sortie rate is going to be extremely limited. Chinese aircraft, meanwhile, could carry out 3 to 4 times the number of sorties of American aircraft and enjoy the protection of shore-based air defense networks as they repel waves of American attack aircraft. The U.S. Navy's plan for its next-generation fighter includes a requirement for a nearly 50% expanded fuel tank just for this fact alone, partly because U.S. carriers might no longer be safe operating within hundreds of miles of active combat zones due to the missile threat. But for all the advantages China enjoys, it has one glaring weakness, and it could prove fatal. China relies on sea trade for the majority of its imports and exports, and the overwhelming majority of critical oil products. Despite fielding the world's largest navy, the Chinese Navy is still incapable of sustaining operations far from home, meaning it's unable to take on the U.S. Navy in the 2 places it needs to secure if it wants to avoid a catastrophic defeat: the Straits of Malacca and the Gulf of Oman. Both are choke points through which Chinese oil passes, and both are too far away for the Chinese military to consistently defend them. This is why China has taken a keen interest in developing a carrier force and is set to have as many as 5 aircraft carriers by 2030, rivaling but not matching the United States in carrier power. Just like American carriers are increasingly vulnerable assets, though, Chinese aircraft carriers attempting to operate far from home would be just as vulnerable, especially when one considers that the United States enjoys the luxury of having military facilities in friendly countries all around both critical choke points. Chinese carrier battle groups would come under attack from multiple directions, and this is a strategic position that no amount of ballistic missiles or naval forces can solve. China's use of ballistic missiles also threatens widening the scope of the war, and it might not be able to afford to do so. At the onset of hostilities, China would have to make a critical decision to launch attacks on U.S. installations in South Korea, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines, to name a few. Doing so would cripple U.S. forces in the region. Not doing so would mean that China would allow the U.S. the opportunity to build a significant regional power with which to strike back. For Chinese military planners, it's walking a thin line, because not striking those bases is nearly a guarantee of defeat, yet striking them is guaranteed to bring host nations into the conflict. Missile strikes against U.S. and shared facilities across the region would inevitably end with both military and civilian casualties for the host nation. This would be certain to bring those nations' militaries into the conflict, but even if not, anger them to the point of backing U.S.-led sanctions, and more importantly, it would turn global opinion even further from China. China has learned a lot from Russia's failed invasion of Ukraine and the staggering backlash by the global community. For decades, China has leveraged its explosive economy as a tool of national defense, hoping to intrinsically integrate itself into national economies around the world to the point that a nation would be hesitant to break those links. In 2020, trade between Europe and China totaled $732 billion and growing annually. Economists have described the trade relationship between Europe and China as too big to fail, and the economic fallout of war might be too high a cost to bear for European nations. But the relationship between the US and China is even more important for Europe. With over $1.1 trillion in trade between America and the EU, Europe is also in a nearly symbiotic defense relationship with the United States, and it relies on it as a guarantor of its security. It's easy to see which way Europe would swing, and along with it, the massive influence that the EU wields across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has proven another point, though. The world looks disfavorably on international aggressors, an irony not lost on observers of the second US-led invasion of Iraq. But the United States has political capital that China simply does not have, and is unlikely to acquire anytime soon. An authoritarian country attacking a peaceful democratic one is going to give China extremely bad optics and rapidly shift global opinion against it. In 2019, a global survey saw 40% of those surveyed holding a negative opinion on China, with Western Europe and Asia all having a median average of over 50% negative views on China. Exactly the two regions China most desperately needs support from. To make matters worse, the United States is finally waking up from its two-decade anti-terrorism bender and is remembering that major conventional war is still a thing. It's increasing investments in long-range weapons, stealth combat platforms, and a plan to field 373 surface combat vessels with 150 unmanned surface and undersea vessels means that China is facing an increasingly uphill battle in the Pacific. But for now, the short-term advantage is China's, but only if it can avoid a long-term protracted war. This means it must launch a bolt-out-of-the-blue attack on the US forces before they're ready, and hope that with overwhelming and decisive firepower, as well as a politically divisive disinformation campaign, it can beat the US public into submission and against supporting a protracted conflict that China is sure to lose. Many Chinese officials believe that after decades of military overmatch in conflicts, the American public is soft and unwilling to shoulder the heavy burden of a major and long conventional war. But this was the same mistake that the Imperial Japanese forces made in World War II when they struck Pearl Harbor. The fun part is you and I are probably going to get to find out who's right in the next few years. And with neither side being able to afford losing, nuclear escalation is incredibly likely. Now go check out Russia and China versus NATO, or click this other video instead.